The early morning sun cast long shadows across the peaceful streets of Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most prestigious neighborhoods. Dr. Marcus Thompson stepped out of his beautiful three-story brownstone home, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. At 35 years old, he had already achieved what many would consider the American dream. He was the youngest chief of emergency medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, had a loving family, and had recently moved into his dream home. Marcus checked his smartwatch, 6:30 a.m. Perfect timing for his morning run before his afternoon shift at the hospital. He adjusted his premium wireless earbuds and began his warm-up stretches on his front steps. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional chirping of birds and rustling of golden leaves breaking the silence. Dressed in his black Nike running gear and bright orange running shoes, Marcus cut an impressive figure. Years of disciplined exercise had kept him fit, a necessity for the long and demanding hours in the emergency room. His dark skin glistened with a thin layer of moisturizer he always applied before running to protect himself from the cool morning air. As he started his jog, Marcus couldn't help but smile. It had been 3 months since they moved into this neighborhood, and he was still amazed at how different it was from the busy South End where he grew up. Here, the streets were wider, the houses more grand, and the gardens perfectly manicured. Some of his colleagues had raised eyebrows when he mentioned moving to Beacon Hill. It wasn't common to see many black families in this area, but Marcus had worked hard for this, and his wife Lisa had fallen in love with the historical architecture. Speaking of architecture, Lisa had asked him to take photos of some of the houses during his run. As an interior decorator working on a historical renovation project, she was particularly interested in the authentic Victorian elements that many homes in the neighborhood had maintained. Marcus pulled out his iPhone 15 Pro Max and started taking pictures of interesting architectural details, a beautifully carved doorway here, an intricate window frame there. The morning was peaceful, and Marcus mentally reviewed his upcoming shift while maintaining his steady pace. The emergency room had been particularly busy lately with the flu season starting early this year. As chief of emergency medicine, he had to ensure everything ran smoothly, especially during peak hours. He had a meeting with the hospital board next week about increasing their staff numbers, and he wanted to be well prepared. His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, who was already out tending to her prized roses. She waved warmly at him, and Marcus waved back. Mrs. Chen had been one of the first neighbors to welcome his family to the area, bringing over a homemade apple pie and offering Lisa gardening tips. Her kind gesture had meant a lot to them during those first few weeks of settling in. Marcus continued his run, passing by the local coffee shop that was just opening its doors. The smell of freshly baked pastries and brewing coffee wafted through the air, making his stomach rumble slightly. He made a mental note to pick up Lisa's favorite caramel macchiato on his way back home. As he rounded the corner onto Chestnut Street, Marcus slowed his pace to take a few more photos. The morning light was perfect now, casting a golden glow on the historic facades. Lisa would be thrilled with these shots. He had just stopped to capture a particularly stunning bay window when he noticed a woman watching him from her window with a suspicious look on her face. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. He was used to occasional stares in the neighborhood. He had learned to brush off these moments, focusing instead on the many neighbors who had welcomed him and his family warmly. After all, he was a respected doctor, a loving husband, and a proud father. No amount of prejudice could take that away from him. Little did Marcus know that this peaceful morning was about to take an unexpected turn. As he continued taking photos of the architectural details, the woman from the window had already picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the numbers 9211. The quiet morning was about to become anything but peaceful, and Dr. Marcus Thompson's character would soon be tested in ways he never expected. Sarah Henderson prided herself on being the neighborhood's self-appointed watchdog. At 52, she had lived in Beacon Hill for over 2 decades and considered herself the keeper of its prestigious reputation. From behind her lace curtains, she watched the black man in running gear taking pictures of different houses. Her thin lips pressed together in disapproval as she grabbed her phone and house keys. "Not in my neighborhood," she muttered, straightening her designer cardigan. Sarah had already called the police, but she wasn't going to just wait around. She marched out of her house, her expensive shoes clicking against the sidewalk as she approached Dr. Thompson. Marcus was reviewing the photos he had just taken when he heard the aggressive clicking of heels behind him. Before he could turn around, a sharp voice cut through the morning air. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Sarah's voice was loud enough to make several birds fly away from a nearby tree. Her face was red with what she believed was righteous anger. Marcus turned around calmly, already recognizing the tone. He had heard it before in other neighborhoods, in other situations. He gave her his most professional smile, the same one he used to reassure worried patients in the ER. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm just taking some architectural photos for my wife. She's an interior decorator working on a—" "Do you really expect me to believe that?" Sarah cut him off, her voice dripping with disbelief. She clutched her designer handbag tighter. "I've been watching you. You're clearly casing these houses. This is a respectable neighborhood." A couple walking their golden retriever slowed down to watch the scene unfold. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his face remained composed. Years of handling emergency room crises had taught him to stay calm in tense situations. "Ma'am, I live here. My name is Dr. Marcus Thompson. I live at 47 Chestnut Street, just 3 houses down from—" Sarah let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the historic buildings. "Oh, now you're claiming to be a doctor? In this neighborhood?" She pulled out her phone, making sure he could see it. "Well, I've already called the police. They'll sort this out." Marcus slowly reached for his wallet, maintaining eye contact with Sarah. "I can show you my ID and my hospital badge." "Don't move." Sarah took a step back, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "Keep your hands where I can see them." By now, more neighbors had gathered on their porches to watch. Mrs. Chen had stopped tending to her roses and was hurrying toward them, her gardening gloves still on. The couple with the golden retriever had moved closer, their faces showing concern, though it wasn't clear if their concern was for Sarah or for Marcus. "Sarah Henderson." Mrs. Chen's voice was firm as she approached. "What are you doing?" "That's Dr. Thompson." "Stay back, Margaret," Sarah warned, still holding her phone like a weapon. "This man is suspicious. He's taking pictures of our homes." Marcus remained still, his hands visible at his sides. His medical training had taught him how to handle volatile situations, and right now, Sarah reminded him of patients in the midst of a panic attack, irrational, afraid, and potentially dangerous. "Mrs. Henderson," he said calmly, using his doctor voice, "I understand you're concerned about the safety of our neighborhood. That's actually one of the reasons my wife and I chose to live here. If you'd like, we can walk together to my house. My wife Lisa is home, and she can show you the renovation project she's working on." Sarah's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained hostile. "Our neighborhood? Please. Do you know how much these houses cost? There's no way someone like you could." The sound of police sirens in the distance cut her off. Sarah's face showed triumph as she saw a police car turning onto their street. "Now we'll get to the bottom of this," she said, a smug smile spreading across her face. Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He had been in similar situations before, but this was the first time it had happened in front of his own home, in his own neighborhood. As the police car pulled up to the curb, he could see Mrs. Chen pulling out her phone, presumably to call his wife. The morning sun continued to shine brightly, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath it, as Dr. Marcus Thompson prepared to face yet another challenge to his basic right to exist in his own neighborhood. The police car pulled up smoothly to the curb, its blue and white colors gleaming in the morning sun. 2 officers stepped out, Officer Mike Rodriguez and Officer James Chen. The small crowd of neighbors watched as they approached the scene, some recording with their phones, others whispering among themselves. Sarah Henderson straightened her cardigan and walked quickly toward the officers, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here. This man has been taking pictures of our homes, and he's claiming he lives here. He even says he's a doctor." Her voice carried a mix of fear and triumph. Dr. Thompson remained exactly where he was, hands visible at his sides. He had been in enough similar situations to know the drill. The morning breeze felt cooler now as he watched the officers approach. "Ma'am, please step aside," Officer Rodriguez said professionally, moving past Sarah. His partner, Officer Chen, was already looking at Dr. Thompson with a puzzled expression. "Can you identify yourself, sir?" Officer Rodriguez asked, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Of course," Marcus replied calmly. I'm Dr. Marcus Thompson, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital. I live at 47 Chestnut Street, just 3 houses down. I was taking pictures of the architecture for my wife's interior decoration project. Sarah interrupted loudly. That's ridiculous. There's no way he could. Ma'am, Officer Chen cut her off firmly. Please let us handle this. He turned back to Marcus. Dr. Thompson, do you have any identification? Yes, I do. My wallet is in my back pocket, and my hospital ID is in my running belt. May I reach for them? Both officers nodded, and Marcus slowly retrieved his identification. As he handed them over, Mrs. Chen from next door hurried forward again, still wearing her gardening gloves. Officers, this is absolutely ridiculous. Dr. Thompson is my neighbor. He and his lovely wife moved in 3 months ago. They brought us homemade cookies. Mrs. Chen's face was flushed with anger at Sarah. Officer Rodriguez examined the IDs carefully, then shared a look with his partner. Dr. Thompson, he said, I apologize for the disturbance. We had to respond to the call, but clearly there's been a misunderstanding. Sarah's face began to change color. What? You can't be serious. Those IDs could be fake. Officer Chen turned to Sarah, his expression stern. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Thompson is exactly who he says he is. In fact, he added with a slight smile, he treated my mother in the ER last month after her fall. She hasn't stopped talking about how kind and professional he was. The gathered neighbors began to murmur more loudly now. Sarah's face turned from red to pale as she realized her mistake. A young couple who had been recording the incident on their phones shook their heads in disgust. But he was taking pictures. Sarah protested weakly, her voice losing its earlier confidence. Marcus spoke up, his voice steady and professional. As I tried to explain, Mrs. Henderson, my wife Lisa is an interior decorator. She's working on a historical renovation project and asked me to photograph some of the Victorian architectural details in the neighborhood during my morning run. He pulled out his phone. Would you like to see the photos? Officer Rodriguez handed back Marcus's IDs. Dr. Thompson, you're free to continue your morning. Mrs. Henderson, he turned to Sarah, making false police reports is a serious offense. Consider this a warning. Sarah stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing without words. The small crowd of neighbors had grown, and many were openly glaring at her. Mrs. Chen had moved to stand protectively next to Marcus, her gardening gloves crossed over her chest. I just wanted to protect our neighborhood, Sarah stammered, her voice small and uncertain. From what, Sarah? Mrs. Chen asked sharply. From a respected doctor? From a wonderful neighbor? Or is it something else you're afraid of? The morning had grown warmer, but Sarah felt a chill run through her body. The situation had completely backfired, and now she stood exposed in front of her neighbors, her prejudices laid bare in the bright morning sun. Just as Officer Rodriguez began explaining to Sarah the serious consequences of making false police reports, something unexpected happened. Sarah's face suddenly contorted, her hand flying to her chest. Her designer handbag dropped to the sidewalk as she stumbled backward, gasping for air. No one realized it yet. The morning's drama was far from over, and Dr. Marcus Thompson's true character was about to be revealed in a way that would change everything. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Sarah Henderson's face as she took several unsteady steps backward. Her expensive handbag lay forgotten on the ground, its contents spilling onto the sidewalk. The small crowd of neighbors watched as her face turned from pink to gray. I don't feel. Sarah's words came out as a whisper before her legs began to buckle beneath her. Dr. Thompson's medical instincts kicked in before anyone else could react. In 3 quick steps, he was beside her, catching her arm just as she started to fall. Officer Rodriguez quickly moved to help support her other side. Get her lying down, Marcus commanded, his voice shifting from the calm neighbor to the confident chief of emergency medicine. Officer Chen, call for an ambulance immediately. The gathered neighbors gasped and murmured as Sarah was gently lowered to the ground. Mrs. Chen rushed forward with a garden cushion from her yard, placing it under Sarah's head. The same woman who had been hurling accusations just moments ago now lay pale and gasping on the sidewalk. Marcus knelt beside her, his fingers finding her pulse point. Sarah, can you hear me? I'm Dr. Thompson, and I'm going to help you. Can you tell me what you're feeling? Sarah's eyes were wide with fear as she clutched at her chest. Can't breathe, she managed to say between gasps. Pressure. Here. She weakly tapped her chest. Marcus's trained eyes noticed her blue-tinged fingertips and the way she was struggling for air. He had seen these symptoms hundreds of times in the ER. Looking up at Officer Rodriguez, he spoke with quiet authority. I need a first aid kit from your patrol car if you have one, and someone get me the aspirin from my running belt, front pocket. Mrs. Chen, who had been hovering nearby, quickly retrieved the aspirin while Officer Rodriguez ran to his car. The young couple who had been recording earlier had stopped filming and were now helping to keep other neighbors at a respectful distance. Sarah, listen to me carefully, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. I believe you're having a cardiac event. I'm going to give you an aspirin to chew. It's going to help, but we need to get you to the hospital. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at the man she had just accused of being a criminal. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. I'm sorry, she whispered between labored breaths. I was wrong? Save your energy, Marcus replied professionally, helping her take the aspirin. We can talk about that later. Right now, I need you to focus on staying calm and breathing slowly. Officer Rodriguez returned with the first aid kit, and Marcus quickly pulled out a blood pressure cuff. As he worked, Officer Chen coordinated with the approaching ambulance over his radio. The morning air was filled with the distant sound of sirens getting closer. Some of the neighbors had begun to pray quietly, while others helped direct traffic away from the scene. Mrs. Chen had taken Sarah's hand, patting it gently despite their earlier confrontation. The golden retriever that had witnessed the entire incident sat quietly nearby, as if standing guard. BP is 160/95, Marcus announced to Officer Chen, who relayed the information to the approaching EMTs. Pulse is rapid and irregular. Sarah squeezed Mrs. Chen's hand as another wave of chest pain hit her. The fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, shame and regret as she looked at Dr. Thompson's focused face above her. The sound of sirens grew louder as the ambulance turned onto their street. Marcus continued monitoring Sarah's vital signs, his runner's watch now serving as a medical timer. The same hands she had feared earlier were now potentially saving her life. They're almost here, Marcus assured her, his voice steady. You're doing great, Sarah. Just keep breathing slowly for me. As the ambulance parked and the EMTs jumped out with their equipment, no one in the gathered crowd could miss the irony of the situation. The man Sarah Henderson had judged so harshly based on his skin color was now fighting to save her life with the same dedication he showed to all his patients. The early morning sun continued to climb in the sky, illuminating a scene very different from the one that had started just minutes ago. And as the EMTs rushed forward with their gurney, Dr. Marcus Thompson prepared to give them his professional assessment, proving that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in times of crisis. The ambulance's flashing lights painted the peaceful Beacon Hill Street in alternating red and white. Two EMTs, Jenny Martinez and Tom Sullivan, rushed toward Sarah with their medical equipment. The morning had turned into something none of the neighbors had expected. What do we have, Doctor? Jenny asked, recognizing Dr. Thompson from their many encounters in the ER. Marcus shifted into full emergency mode, his voice clear and professional. Female patient, early 50s, showing signs of acute myocardial infarction. Symptoms began approximately 7 minutes ago. BP 160/95, pulse rapid and irregular. I administered one aspirin 3 minutes ago. Sarah lay on the sidewalk, still struggling for breath, her eyes darting between the EMTs and Dr. Thompson. The same man she had tried to have arrested was now rattling off medical information that could save her life. Tom quickly attached ECG leads to Sarah's chest while Jenny prepared the portable monitor. The crowd of neighbors watched in respectful silence, many of them recording the scene on their phones. Not out of spite now, but in awe of the dramatic turn of events. Got the rhythm, Tom announced, turning the monitor so Dr. Thompson could see it. Definite SD elevation in leads V2 through V4. Marcus nodded grimly. Classic STEMI presentation. She needs immediate catheterization. Mass General's cardiac team should be notified right away. Mrs. Chen had moved to gather Sarah's scattered belongings from the sidewalk, carefully placing everything back in the expensive handbag. Officer Rodriguez was on his radio, arranging for traffic control to speed up the ambulance's journey to the hospital. "Sarah," Marcus said, leaning down to meet her frightened eyes, "you're having a heart attack, but you're in good hands. The EMTs are going to take you to Mass General, and I'll call ahead to make sure the cardiac team is ready for you." A tear rolled down Sarah's cheek as she managed to whisper, Why are you helping me? After what I did?" The EMTs were efficiently moving around them, setting up the gurney and preparing for transport. Marcus's response was firm but gentle. "Because you're my patient now, and that's all that matters." Officer Chen had retrieved Sarah's phone from the ground and was scrolling through her contacts. "Ma'am, is there someone we should call? Family?" "My daughter," Sarah gasped. "Rebecca. She's first in contacts." As the EMTs carefully transferred Sarah to the gurney, Marcus pulled out his own phone and dialed the hospital. "This is Dr. Thompson, Chief of Emergency Medicine. We have SSDEMI coming in, approximately 15 minutes out. Female, early 50s, clear SD elevation." He walked a few steps away, coordinating with his team at the hospital. Mrs. Chen approached the gurney, still holding Sarah's handbag. "I'll bring this to the hospital for you later," she said kindly, showing a grace that made Sarah's eyes fill with fresh tears. The young couple who had been recording earlier stepped forward. "We got everything on video," the woman said, her voice gentle. "Not to use against you, but maybe as a reminder that judgment can blind us to the humanity in others." As the EMTs secured Sarah for transport, Marcus returned to her side. "The cardiac team is ready and waiting. Dr. Patricia Wong is the attending cardiologist. She's the best we have. You're going to be in excellent hands." Sarah reached out weakly and caught Marcus's wrist. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion and pain. "I was so wrong about you." "Save your strength," Marcus replied professionally. "We can talk about all of this after you recover." The EMTs began moving the gurney toward the ambulance. The gathered neighbors, who had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature that morning, stepped back to clear a path. The golden retriever that had been watching everything wagged its tail gently as Sarah was wheeled past. Marcus watched as they loaded Sarah into the ambulance, his medical training warring with his morning schedule. He checked his watch. His shift at the hospital didn't start for several hours. Making a quick decision, he turned to Officer Rodriguez. "I'm going to follow them in. She'll need a familiar face in the ER, and I want to brief the cardiac team personally." As the ambulance pulled away with its sirens wailing, the neighbors began to disperse, talking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. The morning sun now stood higher in the sky, illuminating a neighborhood forever changed by events that had started with prejudice but transformed into a powerful lesson about humanity, duty, and the true measure of a person's character. The emergency room at Massachusetts General Hospital buzzed with its usual morning activity when the ambulance carrying Sarah Henderson arrived. Dr. Thompson had followed in his car, still in his running clothes, and was already waiting at the emergency entrance. His familiar face brought immediate attention from the staff. "Dr. Thompson?" One of the nurses looked surprised to see him in workout gear. "Aren't you supposed to be off until this afternoon?" "Change of plans, Maria," Marcus replied, quickly pulling a spare white coat over his running clothes. "We have an incoming SDEMI patient from my neighborhood. Dr. Wong and the cardiac team are ready." Before Maria could answer, the emergency doors burst open. Jenny and Tom wheeled Sarah in, with Jenny calling out vital signs. BPs dropped to 140/90ths, heart rate 115 and irregular, oxygen sat 94%. Dr. Patricia Wong, the hospital's top cardiologist, was already approaching with her team. She raised an eyebrow at Marcus's unusual attire but stayed focused on the patient. "Cath lab is prepped and waiting. What's her story?" As they rushed down the corridor, Marcus gave a quick medical summary, leaving out the morning's earlier drama. Patient experienced sudden onset chest pain and shortness of breath approximately 30 minutes ago. Classic SDEMI presentation with clear SD elevation in leads V2 through V4. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear as they moved her onto the cardiac care unit bed. The hospital lights seemed harsh after the morning sunlight, and the beeping of machines added to her anxiety. She reached out desperately and caught Marcus's hand. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave." Dr. Wong looked at Marcus questioningly. He made a quick decision. "I'll stay with her through the procedure," he said, then turned to Sarah. "But first, we need to contact your daughter. Has anyone reached Rebecca?" "She's on her way," Maria called from the nurse's station, about 20 minutes out. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Nurses efficiently attached new monitoring equipment while Dr. Wong reviewed the latest ECG results. Marcus stayed near Sarah's head, explaining each step in a calm, clear voice. "They're going to take you to the catheterization lab now," he explained. "Dr. Wong is going to find the blocked artery and open it. You'll be awake but comfortable." Sarah's face was pale, but she managed a weak nod. "I never imagined," she started, her voice breaking, "that the man I tried to have arrested would be saving my life." A nurse nearby looked up in surprise, but Marcus kept his professional demeanor. "We can talk about that later. Right now, focus on staying calm and following Dr. Wong's instructions." As they prepared to move to the cath lab, Dr. Wong pulled Marcus aside. "The blockage looks significant. We need to move fast. Are you sure you want to stay? This isn't your department." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was watching them with frightened eyes. "Sometimes a patient needs more than just medical care," he said quietly. "They need to know they're safe, that they're being cared for by people who see them as human beings worthy of respect, regardless of their own prejudices." Dr. Wong nodded understanding and began directing her team to move Sarah to the cath lab. The room was ready, its specialized equipment gleaming under bright lights. As they transferred Sarah onto the procedure table, Marcus helped her get positioned comfortably. "The team is going to clean and numb your right wrist," he explained. "Dr. Wong will insert a tiny tube called a catheter through your artery. You might feel some pressure, but there shouldn't be any pain." Sarah's eyes were filled with tears as she looked up at him. "Dr. Thompson, Marcus, I don't deserve this kindness." "Everyone deserves good medical care," he replied firmly. "Now, take slow, deep breaths for me." As Dr. Wong began the procedure, Marcus stood where Sarah could see him, occasionally explaining what was happening. The monitors beeped steadily, showing her heart's rhythm. The morning's confrontation on the sidewalk seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the focused intensity of medical professionals working to save a life. Through the cath lab window, Marcus saw a young woman arrive at the observation area, Rebecca Henderson, he presumed. She pressed her hand against the glass, watching with worry as the doctors worked to save her mother's life, unaware of the incredible story that had brought them all to this moment. 3 days after the dramatic events on Beacon Hill, Sarah Henderson sat propped up in her hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards. The cardiac care unit at Massachusetts General Hospital had become her temporary home, its rhythmic beeping a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. Rebecca, Sarah's daughter, sat in the visitor's chair beside the bed, scrolling through her phone. She had taken emergency leave from her job in New York to be with her mother. The video of the incident had spread through the neighborhood group chat, and Rebecca had watched it countless times, still struggling to process what had happened. "Mom," Rebecca said quietly, looking up from her phone, "why did you do it? Why did you call the police on Dr. Thompson?" Sarah's fingers played nervously with the edge of her hospital blanket. The heart monitor showed a slight increase in her pulse. "I was wrong, Rebecca, so terribly wrong. I let my prejudices blind me to who he really was." The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, warming the room. A nurse came in to check Sarah's vitals, smiling kindly as she worked. "Dr. Thompson will be doing his rounds soon," she mentioned before leaving. Rebecca watched her mother's face carefully. "You know, if he hadn't been there when you had the heart attack." "I know," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I could have died on that sidewalk. The same man I accused of being a criminal saved my life." Just then, there was a gentle knock on the door. Dr. Thompson entered, wearing his white coat and carrying a tablet. His professional demeanor was the same as it had been during the emergency, but his eyes were kind. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," he said, checking her latest test results on the tablet. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better, Dr. Thompson," Sarah replied, her cheeks flushing slightly with shame. "And please, call me Sarah." Marcus nodded, moving to examine her. "Your latest numbers look good. The stent is doing its job, and your heart function is improving." Dr. Wong is very pleased with your progress. Rebecca stood up, extending her hand. Dr. Thompson, I'm Rebecca Henderson. I can't thank you enough for saving my mom's life. Marcus shook her hand warmly. I was just doing my job. No, Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger now. You did so much more than that. After the way I treated you, most people would have walked away. They would have let someone else handle it. The room fell quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat down, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah, he began, in the emergency room, we have a saying, everyone's the same under their skin. When someone needs medical help, nothing else matters, not their race, not their beliefs, not even their actions. Tears began rolling down Sarah's cheeks. I've had a lot of time to think these past few days. What I did, about my assumptions, about the kind of person I've been. She wiped her eyes with a tissue Rebecca handed her. My own prejudices almost cost me my life. Rebecca reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. Mom's been telling me about the changes she wants to make, Dr. Thompson, about making things right. Marcus nodded encouragingly. Change isn't easy, but recognizing the need for it is the first step, and please, call me Marcus. Sarah took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the lingering chest pain. The neighbors have been so kind, sending flowers and cards. Even Mrs. Chen visited yesterday, bringing me Chinese herbs for healing. She looked down at her hands. I don't deserve their kindness. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, Marcus replied. What matters is what you do with that chance. The morning light filled the room as Sarah shared her plans for making amends. Joining the Neighborhood Inclusion Committee, volunteering at the local community center, and most importantly, becoming an advocate against racial profiling. As Marcus stood to continue his rounds, Sarah called out, Dr. Thompson, Marcus, when I'm released, would you and your wife consider coming over for dinner? I'd like to properly introduce myself to my neighbors. Marcus smiled warmly. We'd like that, Sarah, but first, focus on getting stronger. You have a lot of good work ahead of you. As he left the room, Rebecca hugged her mother gently. The heart monitor beeped steadily, marking not just Sarah's physical recovery, but the beginning of a deeper healing, one that would touch not just her heart, but her soul. 1 month after the incident, the Beacon Hill Community Center buzzed with activity. The monthly neighborhood association meeting was about to begin, but this one was different from any before. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond their prestigious neighborhood. Sarah Henderson stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She looked healthier now, though still a bit pale. Her daughter Rebecca sat in the front row, giving her an encouraging smile. Dr. Marcus Thompson and his wife Lisa sat nearby, along with Mrs. Chen and many other neighbors who had witnessed the events of that fateful morning. Thank you all for coming, Sarah began, her voice shaky but determined. Most of you know why we're here. Some of you were there that morning when my prejudice nearly cost me my life. Today, I want to share what I've learned and the changes we need to make in our community. The room fell silent as Sarah recounted the events of that morning, her suspicious thoughts, her hasty judgment, the 911 call, and then the heart attack that changed everything. As she spoke, many people glanced at Dr. Thompson, who sat listening with quiet dignity. I was so focused on protecting our neighborhood, Sarah continued, that I became the very thing that makes neighborhoods unsafe, a person who judges others based on their skin color. Her voice grew stronger. Dr. Thompson didn't just save my life with his medical skills. He saved my soul with his compassion. Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes as her mother announced the creation of the Beacon Hill Inclusion Council, with Dr. Thompson as one of its key advisors. The council would work to prevent racial profiling, promote community unity, and educate residents about unconscious bias. Mrs. Chen stood up next, surprising everyone by walking to the podium. I've lived here for 30 years, she said, her voice clear and strong. This is the first time we're openly discussing these issues. Sarah's courage in admitting her mistakes and working to make changes has inspired many of us. The young couple who had recorded the original incident then presented their project, a documentary about the transformation of their community, starting with that morning's events. They had interviewed many neighbors, including Sarah and Dr. Thompson, creating a powerful teaching tool for other communities facing similar issues. When Marcus finally took the podium, the room fell silent again. He looked around at the faces, some familiar, some new, all attentive. "What happened that morning was unfortunate," he began, "but it's what we do after our mistakes that defines us." Sarah could have quietly recovered and avoided this difficult conversation. Instead, she chose to turn her experience into an opportunity for change. Lisa Thompson stood beside her husband, adding her perspective as one of the few other black residents in the neighborhood. "Change starts with honest conversations," she said. "It starts with admitting our biases and actively working to overcome them." The meeting continued with the introduction of new initiatives: monthly community dinners to bring neighbors together, workshops on cultural sensitivity, and a mentoring program connecting diverse professionals with local students. Sarah had worked tirelessly from her recovery bed to help organize these programs. As the formal meeting ended and people mingled over coffee and Mrs. Chen's homemade cookies, Sarah approached the Thompsons. The three of them had shared several dinners since her recovery, but this moment felt different. "Thank you," she said simply, hugging Lisa and then Marcus. "Not just for saving my life, but for helping me become a better person." Marcus smiled warmly. "You did the hard work, Sarah. You faced your prejudices and chose to change. That takes real courage." The evening sun streamed through the community center windows, casting a golden glow over the gathered neighbors. The golden retriever that had witnessed the original incident lay contentedly by its owner's feet, watching the humans talk and laugh together. Rebecca joined them, carrying a plate of Mrs. Chen's cookies. "Mom," she said proudly, "the city council wants to use our inclusion program as a model for other neighborhoods." Sarah looked around the room, at the diverse faces, at the animated conversations, at the genuine connections being formed. The heart attack had nearly ended her life, but instead, it had given her a new beginning. Her hand unconsciously touched her chest, feeling her heart beating strongly. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes it takes a shock to the heart to open your eyes and change your mind." As the community center buzzed with conversation and plans for the future, no one could deny that Beacon Hill had changed. What had started as a moment of prejudice had transformed into a movement of understanding, proving that even the worst moments can lead to the best changes when people open their hearts and minds to growth.